put some more addresses out here at later meetings. Okay, I don't think that Sarah or Harry Hollister really need any introduction. I think you all know them. They're Colrain natives. The one thing that I would mention is that they both acquired a taste for local colorist literature, and they will talk about what that is, from Sarah's father, Harry's grandfather, John Hollister, who was very fond of that literature, and I think probably read it to them, and he certainly got them interested in it. So, Sarah and Harry Hollister. Is that something? Okay. So I'm going to hand.
Anyway, thank you all for coming. I'm just going to give you a brief idea of local color. I'm indebted to this woman, Lois Howard, who in 1938 did her thesis on local color in New England short stories. How lucky was I to find that on the internet? But basically, it's about local color covers characters, dialect and speech, customs, traditions, and descriptions of natural and social backgrounds. And one of the women who you would know is Harriet Beecher Stowe, who of course wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. I'll have this in the back with 5 other authors who Harry and I have to get more material from, because we really just have Alice Brown, who we're reading from tonight, and Sarah Orne Jewett, which my dad was a huge fan of. So this will be in the back if you want to see this and some of the books later on. But now I'll take it away, put this away. I'll take my book. And Harry, you're going to introduce the story once I find it here. Give me a second.
Yes, I'll have to look as well.
We have numerous copies of this book that the story is from, which is called
others, I believe, beyond these 2.
Meadowgrass is the name of the book.
See the nice gilt cover here. Well, a little piece of it there. But we were thinking about, is that a little, it's very echoey, isn't it? What can be done about that?
Is it me?
Hmm? Which mic? Yes, see the reverb is turned halfway up.
Well, we were fiddling with knobs earlier when we were trying to figure it out.
That's better.
Okay.
Not echoing like a stadium anymore. So we decided we'd try to look for one that had a pretty decent amount of dialogue back and forth in it, not just not just description without much dialogue. And this one is entitled Mrs. Wadley's Guest. The premise of it being a woman who returns from a vacation to find a certain sort of surprise waiting at her home. And there are 4 characters in it. It begins in the home of Cyrus and Miranda Pendleton. And at the beginning, hopefully it won't be too confusing when we switch, because at the beginning I'm going to read Cyrus and Sadie is going to read Miranda. And then when Mrs. Wadley herself enters the room, I'm going to play her for a bit, because the 2 of them have a lot of back and forth, and Cyrus says very little. And then Mrs. Wadley goes off on her own, and I will become the other character after that. But, I mean, first to say that I imagine it was Sadie who showed me these books probably 10 or 15 or more years ago now, 15-ish. And it was just kind of neat to know that they had been my grandfather's, and I knew he had enjoyed them. So they're pretty interesting. They make a nice little thing to take up that last 20 minutes of the evening when I'm not quite ready for bed yet, take it off the shelf and read one of the good ones through again. So I guess we might as well get going, unless you've got anything else to say, Sadie.
Nope.
All right. Water, I suppose.
Oh, I brought some. Oh, it's over there. That's a good place for it. My assistant will bring it up for me. Hold on, let me just open it so I'm not like fiddling with it during the show.
Right.
All right.
Not gonna trip. Excellent.
All right. On with the show.
Yes. Cyrus Pendleton sat by the kitchen fire, his stockinged feet in the oven, and his hands stretched out toward the kettles, which were bubbling prosperously away and puffing a cloud of steam into his face. He was a meager, sad-colored man, with mutton-chop whiskers so thin as to lie as a shadow on his fallen cheeks, and his glance, wherever it fell, seemed to deprecate a reproof. Thick layers of flannel swathed his throat, and from time to time he coughed wheezingly, with the air of one who, having a cold, was determined to be conscientious about it. A voice from the buttery began pouring forth words only a little slower than the blackbird sings, and with no more reference to reply.
Cyrus, don't you feel a mite better? Though I don't know how you could expect to, after such a night as you had, Aunt puffin' and blowin'. Mrs. Pendleton followed the voice. She seemed to be borne briskly in on its wings, and came scudding over the kitchen sill, carrying pans of freshly sifted flour. She set it down on the table and began stirring up. I don't know where you got such a cold, unless it's in the air, she continued. Folks say they're round nowadays, and you catch 'em just as you would the mumps. But there, nobody on your side or mine ever had the mumps as long as I can remember, except Elkanah, though, and he catched 'em down to Portsmouth when he went off on that fool's errand after alewives. Do you suppose you could eat a mite of fish for dinner?
I was thinking, interposed Cyrus mildly, but his wife swept past him and took the road.
I don't know if there's any use in getting a real dinner, just you and me, and you not working either. Folks say there's more danger of eating too much than too little. Gilman Lane, though, he kept eating less and less, and his stomach dried up till it twa'n't no bigger than a bladder. Look here, you. I shouldn't wonder a mite if you got some of those stomach troubles along with your cold. You ain't acted as if you'd relished a meal of victuals for nigh unto 10 days. Soon as I get my hands out of the flour, I'll look in the doctor's book and find out. My, how het up I be. She wiped her hands on the roller towel and unpinned the little plaid shawl drawn tightly across her shoulders. It disclosed a green Sontag, and under that manifold layers of jacket and waist. She was amply protected from the cold. I don't know as I ought to be stirring up Ryan Injun, she went on, returning to her vigorous tossing and mixing at the table. Some may say the steam was bad for your lungs. Anyhow, the doctor's book holds you've got to pick out a dry climate if you don't want to go into a decline. Let me see, when your Aunt Maggie was took, how long was it afore she really given up? After she began to cough, I mean.
Cyrus moved uneasily. I don't know, he said hastily. I never kept a run of such things. But Mirandy, pouring her batter into the pan, heeded him no more than was her wont.
I suppose that was real galloping consumption, she said with relish. I must ask Sister Sarah how long 'twas next time I see her. She set it down with the births and deaths.
Cyrus was moved to some remonstrance. He often felt the necessity of asserting himself, lest he should presently hear his own passing bell and epitaph. I guess you needn't stop steaming bread for me. I ain't half so stuffed up as I was yesterday. Mrs. Pendleton clapped the loaf into the pot, wrinkling her face over the cloud of steam that came puffing into it.
There, she explained. Now perhaps I can get a minute to sit down. I ain't bound to shoe today. My, who's that out in this weather?
The side door was pushed open and then shut with a bang. A vigorous stamping of snow followed, and then the inner door swung in to admit a woman, very short, very stout, with a round, apple-cheeked face and twinkling eyes looking out from the enveloping folds of a gray cloud. Well, she said in a cheery voice, beginning at once to unwind the cloud, here I be. Didn't think I'd rain down, did ya? I thought myself one spell I should freeze afore I fell. Mrs. Pendleton hurried forward, wiping her hands on her apron as she went.
For the land's sake, Martha Wadley, she cried, laying hold of the newcomer by the shoulders and giving her an ineffectual but wholly delighted shake. Well, I never. Who brought you over? Though I don't know which way you came, I ain't looked out.
I walked from the corner, said Mrs. Wadley, who never felt any compunction about interrupting her old neighbor. She was unpinning her shawl composedly, as one sure of a welcome. How do, Cyrus? Jim Thomas took me up just beyond the depot and give me a lift on his sled, but I was all of a shiver, and at the corner I told him he'd better let me step down and walk. So I come the rest of the way afoot and alone. You ain't going to use the oven, be ya? I'll just stick my feet in a minute. No, Cyrus, don't you move. I'll take the other side. I guess we shan't come to blows over it. She seemed to have brought into the kitchen, with that freshness of outdoor air which the newcomer bears, like a balsam in his garments, a breath of fuller life and even of jollity. As she sat there in her good brown dress, with her worked collar fashioned by a large cameo, her gold beads just showing, and her plump hands folded in a capacious lap, she looked the picture of jovial content, quite able to take care of herself, and perhaps apply a sturdy shoulder to the lagging machinery of the world. "Didn't you get word I was coming this week?" she asked. "I sent you a line."
No, we ain't been so fur as the post office, answered Mirandy absently. She was debating over her most feasible bill of fare now that a pick-up dinner seemed no longer possible. Moreover, she had something on her mind, and she could not help thinking how unfortunate it was that Cyrus shared her secret. Who could tell at what moment he might broach it? She doubted his discretion. The roads wa'n't broke out till day before yesterday.
"I should think they were," said Mrs. Wadley scornfully. "Shouldn't think," testing the heat with a hand on her skirt and then lifting the breadths back over her quilted petticoat. "I thought that would be the way on it, but I'd made up my mind to come, and come I would. Cyrus, what's the matter with you? Nothing more'n a cold, is it?" Cyrus had withdrawn from the stove and was feeling his chin uncertainly. "Oh, no, I guess not," he said. "We've been kind of peaked for a week or two all over the neighborhood, but I guess we shall come out on it now we got into the spring. Mirandy, you get me a mite of hot water, and I'll see if I can't shave." Mirandy was vigorously washing potatoes at the sink, but she turned in ever-ready remonstrance.
Shave, she ejaculated. Well, I guess you won't shave such a day as this, in this cold bedroom with stocking leg around your throat and all. You want to get your death? Why, 'twas only last night, Marthy, he had a hemlock sweat and all the ginger tea I could get down into him. And then I didn't know—
"Oh, la, let him alone," said Marthy, with a comfortable, throaty laugh. "He'll feel twice as well. Get some of them things off his neck. Here, Cyrus, you reach me down your mug. Ain't them your shaving things up there? And I'll fill it for you. You get him a piece of flannel, Mirandy, to put on when he's washed and took all that stuff off his throat. Why, he's got enough wool round there, if 'twas all in yarn, to knit old Toby a pair of mittens. And they say one of his thumbs was bigger than the hand of Providence. You don't want to try all the goodness out of him, do you?" Cyrus gave one swift glance at his wife. "There, you see," it said, "I am not without defenders." He took down his shaving mug with an air of some bravado, but Mirandy was no shrew. She was simply troubled about many things.
Well, she said, compressing her lips and wrinkling her forehead in resignation, if folks want to kill themselves, I can't hinder 'em. But when he's down again, I shall be the one who has to take care of him, that's all. Here, Cyrus, don't you go into that cold bedroom. You shave you here if you're determined to do it.
So Cyrus, after honing his razor with the pleasure of a bored child provided at last with occupation, betook himself to the glass set in the lower part of the clock, and there, with much contortion of his thin visage, proceeded to shave. Mirandy put her potatoes on to boil, and set the fish on the stove to freshen. Then she sat down by the window with a great basket beside her, and began to bind shoes. "Here," said Mrs. Wadley, coming to her feet and adjusting her skirt. "You give me a needle. I've got my thimble right here in my pocket. It's 3 months since I seen a shoe. I should admire to do a pair or two. I wish I could promise you more, but somehow I'm bewitched to get home right after dinner." Mrs. Pendleton laid down her work and leaned back in her chair. Cyrus turned, cleared his throat, and looked at her.
Marthy, you ain't going over there to that lonesome house this cold snap.
"Ain't I?" asked Mrs. Wadley composedly, as she trimmed the top of her shoe preparatory to binding it. "Well, you see if I ain't."
In the first place, the crossroad ain't broke out, and you can't get there. I don't know as a horse could plow through, and supposing they could, Cyrus ain't no more fit than a fly to carry you over.
"Don't you worry," said Mrs. Wadley, binding off one top. "While I've got my own legs, I don't mean to be beholden to nobody. I've had a proper nice time all winter, first with Lucy, then with Anne, and I tell you, 'tain't everybody that's got 2 daughters married so well. But for the last fortnight, I've been in a real tew to come home. They kept me till I wouldn't stay no longer, and now I got so near as this, I ain't gonna stop for nobody." Mrs. Pendleton looked despairingly at her husband, and he, absently wiping his razor on a bit of paper, looked at her.
Marthy, no, Cyrus, don't you say one word. You can't go. There's somebody there.
Mrs. Wadley in turn put down her work. Somebody there? Where?
In your house.
In my house? What for?
I don't know.
Dunno. Well, what are they doing there?
I don't know that. I only know there's somebody there.
Here the brown bread kettle boiled over, creating a diversion, and Miranda gladly rose to set it further back. A slight heat had come into Mrs. Wadley's manner. "Cyrus," said she with emphasis, "I should like to have you speak. I left that house in your care. I left the key with you, and I should like to know who you've been and got in there." Cyrus opened his mouth and then closed it again without saying a word. He looked appealingly at his wife, and she took up the tale with some joy now that the first plunge had been made.
"Well," she said, folding her hands in her apron and beginning to rock back and forth, a little color coming into her cheeks and her eyes snapping vigorously. "You see, this was the way it was. Cyrus, do let me speak." Cyrus had ineffectually opened his mouth again. "Wanted in November you went away? I thought so. Just after that first sprinkle of snow that looked like 'twould lay all winter. Well, he took the key and hung it up inside the clock, and there 'tis now. And once a week, reg'lar as the day came round, Cyrus went over and opened the winders and aired out the house."
Mrs. Wadley sat, putting her thimble off and on. "I know all about that," she interposed, "but who's in there now? That's what I want to find out."
"I'm coming to that. I don't want to get ahead of my story." And so it went on till come 2 weeks ago Friday, and Cyrus went over just the same as ever. And when he hitched to the gate, he see smoke coming out of the chimney, and there was a man's face at one square of glass. She paused, enjoying her climax.
"Well, why don't you go ahead? Mirandy Jane Pendleton, I could shake you. You can talk fast enough when somebody else wants the floor. How'd he get in? What'd he say for himself?"
"Why, he never said anything. Cyrus didn't see him."
"Didn't see him? I thought he see him looking out the window."
"Why, yes, so he did, but he didn't see him to speak to. He just nailed up the door and come away."
Mrs. Wadley turned squarely upon the delinquent Cyrus, who stood half-shaven, absently honing his razor. "Cyrus," said she with an alarming decision, "will you open your head and tell me what you nailed up that door for, and where you got your nails? I don't suppose you carry 'em round with you, ready for any door it happens to need nailing up?" This fine sarcasm was not lost on Cyrus. He perceived that he had become the victim of a harsh and ruthless dealing. "I had the key to the front door with me, and I thought I'd just step round and nail up t'other one," he said. "There was some nails in the woodshed. Then I heard somebody stepping round inside, and I come away." "You come away," repeated Mrs. Wadley, rising in noble wrath. "You nailed up the door and come away. Well, if you ain't a weak sister. Miranda, you hand me down that key out of the clock while I get my things." She walked sturdily across to the bedroom, and Miranda followed her, wringing her hands in futile entreaty.
"My soul, Marthy, you ain't going over there. You'll be killed as sure as you step foot into the yard. Don't you remember that hired man down to Sudley told the whole family out into the barn, one after another, and chopped their heads off?"
"You get me the other end of my cloud," commanded Mrs. Wadley. "I'm glad I got on stocking feet. Where's the other mitten? Oh, there it is, down by the stove leg. Cyrus, if you knew how you looked with your face plastered over a lather, you'd wipe it off and hand me down that key. Can't you move? Well, I guess I can reach it myself." She dropped the house key carefully into her pocket and opened the outer door. Both Cyrus and his wife knew they were powerless to stop her.
"Oh, Marthy, do come back," wailed Mrs. Pendleton after her. "You ain't had a mite of dinner, and you'll never get to that house alive."
"I'd rather by half hitch up myself," began Cyrus, but his wife turned upon him at the word, bundled him into the kitchen, and shut the door upon him. Then she went back to her post in the doorway and peered after Mrs. Wadley's square figure on the dazzling road with a melancholy determination to stand by her to the last. Only when it occurred to her that it was unlucky to watch a departing friend out of sight did she shut the door hastily and go in to reproach Cyrus and prepare his dinner. Mrs. Wadley plodded steadily onward. Her face had lost its robustness of scorn and expressed only a cheerful determination. Once or twice her mouth relaxed in retrospective enjoyment of the scene behind her, and she gave vent to a scornful ejaculation.
"A man in my house. I guess we'll see."
She turned into the crossroad, where stood her dear and lonely dwelling, with no neighbors on either side for half a mile. She stopped a moment to gaze about her. The road was almost untraveled, and the snow lay encrusted over the wide fields, sparkling on the heights and blue in the hollows. The brown bushes by a hidden stone wall broke the sheen entrancingly. Here and there a dry leaf fluttered, but only enough to show how still such winter stillness can be, and a flock of little brown birds rose with a soft whir and settled further on. Mrs. Wadley pressed her lips together in a voiceless content, and her eyes took on a new brightness. She had lived quite long enough in the town. Rounding a sweeping bend and ploughing sturdily along, though it was difficult here to find the roadway, she kept her eyes fixed on a patch of sky over a low elm where the chimney would first come into view. But just before it stepped forward to meet her, as she had seen it 1,000 times, a telltale token forestalled it. A delicate blue haze crept out in spiral rings and tinged the sky.
He's got a fire. He's there, my soul. Until now, the enormity of his offense had not penetrated her understanding. She had heard the fact without realizing it.
The house was ancient but trimly kept, and it stood within a spacious yard, now in billows and mounds of snow, under which lay the treasures inherited by the spring. The trellises on either side the door held the bare, clinging arms of jessamine and rose, and the syringa and lilac bushes reached heartily above the snow. As Mrs. Wadley approached the door, she gave a rapid glance at the hop pole in the garden, and wondered if its vine had stood the winter well. That was the 3rd hop vine she'd had from Miranda Pendleton. Mounting the front steps, she drew forth the key and put it in the door. It turned readily enough, but though she gave more than one valiant push, the door itself did not yield. It was evidently barricaded.
My soul!
She stepped back to survey the possibilities of attack, but at that instant, glancing up at the window, she had Cyrus Pendleton's own alarming experience. A head looked out at her and was quickly withdrawn. It was dark, unkempt, and the movement was stealthy.
That's him, said Mrs. Wadley grimly, returning to the charge and knocked civilly at the door. No answer. Then she pushed again. It would not yield. She thought of the ladder in the barn, of the small cellar window. Vain hopes, both of them. Look here, she called aloud. You let me in. I'm the widder Wadley. This is my own house, and I'm real tried standing round here knocking on my own front door. You let me in or I'll get my death a cold.
No answer. And then Mrs. Wadley, as she afterwards explained it, got mad. She plowed her way around the side of the house, not the side where she had seen the face, but by the best room windows, and stepped softly up to the back door. Cyrus Pendleton's nail was no longer there. The man had easily pushed it out. She lifted the latch, and set her shoulder against the panel.
If it's the same old button, it'll give, she thought. And it did give. She walked steadily across the kitchen toward the clock room, where the man, that moment, turned to confront her. He made a little run forward. Then, seeing but one woman, he restrained himself. He was not over 30 years old, a tall, well-built fellow, with very black eyes and black hair. His features were good, but just now his mouth was set, and he looked darkly defiant. Of this, however, Mrs. Wadley did not think, for she was in a hot rage. What under the sun do you mean locking me out of my own house? She cried, stretching out her ridden hands to the fire. And potatoes boiled all over this good kitchen stove. I declare this room's a real hog's nest, and I left it as neat as wax.
Perhaps no man was ever more amazed than this invader. He stood staring at her in silence.
Can't you shut the door? She inquired fractiously, beginning to untie her cloud. And put a stick of wood in the stove? If I don't get het through, I shall catch my death.
He obeyed, seemingly from the inertia of utter surprise. Midway in the act of lifting the stove cover, he glanced at her in sharp suspicion. "Where's the rest?" he asked savagely. "You ain't alone."
Well, I guess I'm alone, returned Mrs. Wadley, drawing off her icy, stockinged feet. She walked all the way from Cyrus Pendleton's. There ain't nobody likely to be round, she continued with grim humor. I never knew 'twas such a God-forsaken hole till I'd been away and come back. No, you needn't be scared. The road ain't broke out, and if 'twas, we should have no callers today. It's got round that there's a man, and I'll warrant the selectmen are all sick abed with colds. But there, she added presently, as the soothing warmth of her own kitchen stove began to penetrate, I don't know as I ought to call it a godforsaken place. I'm kind of glad to get back.
There was silence for a few minutes while she toasted her feet, and the man stood shambling from one foot to the other and furtively watching her and the road. Suddenly she rose and lifted a pot cover.
What you got for dinner? She inquired genially. I'm as holler as a horn.
I put some potatoes on, he said gruffly.
Got any pork, or have you used it all up?
I guess there's pork. I ain't touched it. I ain't eat anything but potatoes, and I've chopped wood for 'em and for what I burnt.
Do tell, said Mrs. Wadley. She set the potatoes forward where they would not boil more vigorously. Well, you go down cellar and bring me up a little piece of pork, streak of fat, and a streak of lean, and I'll fry it. I'll sweep up here a mite while you're gone. Why, I never seen such a lookin' kitchen. What's your name? She called after him as he set his foot on the upper stair.
Joe.
All right then, Joe. You fly round and get the pork. She took down the broom from its accustomed nail and began sweeping joyously. The man, fishing in the pork barrel, listened meanwhile to the regular sound above. Once it stopped, and he held his breath for the moment and stood at bay, ready to dash up the stairs and past his pursuers, had she let them in. But it was only her own step approaching the cellar door. Joe, she called, you bring up a dozen apples. Baldwins, I'll fry them too.
Something past 1 o'clock. They sat down together to such as strange a meal as the little kitchen had ever seen. Bread and butter were lacking, but there was quince preserve drawn from some hidden hoard, the apples and pork and smoking tea. Mrs. Wadley's spirits rose. Home was even better than her dreams had pictured it. She told her strange guest all about her daughter Lucy and her daughter Anne's children, and he listened, quite dazed and utterly speechless.
There, she said at last, rising. I don't know as I ever eat a meat of victuals in my life, but I guess it's better than many a poor soldier used to have. Now, if you've got some wood to chop, you go and do it, and I'll clear up this kitchen. It's a real hurrah's nest if ever there was one.
All that afternoon the stranger chopped wood, pausing from time to time to look from the shed door down the country road, and Mrs. Wadley singing, Fly like a youthful, but oh, their end, their dreadful end, and like melodies which had prevailed when she sat in the seats, flew round indeed, and set the kitchen in immaculate order. Evidently her guest had seldom left that room. He had slept there on the lounge, he had eaten his potatoes there, and smoked his pipe. When the early dusk set in, and Mrs. Wadley had cleared away their supper of baked potatoes and salt fish, again with libations of quince, she drew up before the shining stove and put her feet on the hearth.
Here, she called to the man, who was sitting uncomfortably on one corner of the wood box and eyeing her with some embarrassed watchfulness. You draw up, too. It's the best time of the day now, between sunset and dark.
I guess I'd better be going, he returned doggedly.
Going? Where?
I don't know, but I'm going.
Now look here, said Mrs. Wadley. You take that chair and draw up to the fire. You do as I tell you.
He did it.
Now I can't hinder your going, but if you do go, I've got a word to say to you.
You needn't say it. I don't want nobody's advice.
Well, you've got to have it just the same. When you boil potatoes, don't let 'em run all over the stove. Now, you remember, I've had to let the fire go down and scrub till I could have cried. Don't you ever do such a thing again, wherever you be.
He could only look at her. This sort of woman was entirely new to his experience.
But I've something else to say, she continued, adjusting her feet more comfortably. I ain't going to turn anybody out into the snow on such a night as this. You're welcome to stay, but I want to know what brought you here. I ain't one of them that meddles and makes, and if you ain't done nothing out of the way, and I ain't called on for a witness, you needn't be afraid of my telling.
You will be called on. It's murder. I've killed a man. He turned upon her with a savage challenge in the motion, but her face was set placidly forward, and the growing dusk had veiled its meaning.
Well, she remarked at length, ain't you ashamed to sit there talking about it? You must have enough brass to line a kittle. Why ain't you been like a man and ginned yourself up? Instead of living here and turning my kitchen upside down. Now you tell me about it. It'll do you good.
I'm going, said the man, breathing hard as he spoke. I'm going away from here tonight, and they'll never take me alive. It was this way. There was a man over where I lived that's most drunk himself underground, but he ain't too far gone to do mischief. He told a lie about me and lost me my place in the shoe shop. Then one night I met him going home, and we had words. I struck him. He fell like an ox. I killed him. I didn't go home no more. I didn't even see my wife. I couldn't tell her. I couldn't be took there. So I run away, and when I got starved out and my feet were most froze walking, I see this house all shut up, and I come here. He paused, and the silence was broken only by the slow, cozy ticking of the liberated clock.
Well, be you a drinking man?
I never was till I lost my job. I had a little then, and a little the night he sassed me.
Well. So I suppose you're Joe Mellon, and the man you struck was Solomon Ray.
How'd you know?
Law, I've been visiting over to Hillside way. You couldn't have been very smart not to thought of that when I mentioned my daughter Lucy and where her children went to school. No smarter than you was to depend on that old wooden button. I know all about that drunken scrape. But the queerest part on it was Solomon Ray didn't die.
Didn't die? He didn't die.
Law, no, you can't kill Ray. They brought him to and fixed him up in good shape. I guess you mellowed him some, and he's more scart than hurt. He won't prosecute. You needn't be afraid. He said he dared you to it. There now, I wouldn't. My sake alive. Let me get a light.
For the stranger sat with his head bowed on the table, and he trembled like a child. Next morning at 8 o'clock, Mrs. Wadley was standing at the door in the sparkling light, giving her last motherly injunction to the departing guest.
You know where the depot is, and that 9 o'clock train you've got to take. And you remember what I said about haying time. If you don't have no work by the middle of May, you drop me a line, and perhaps I can take you in, and your wife too. Lucy's children always make a sight of work. You keep that bill safe. And here, wait a minute. You might stop at Cyrus Pendleton's. It's the first house after you pass the corner, and ask him to put spare ribs and a pat of butter into the sleigh and ride over here to dinner. You tell him I'm much obliged to him for sending over last night to see if I was alive, and if I hadn't been so dead with sleep, I couldn't say so. Goodbye. Now you mind keep that tight hold on that bill and spend it prudent. The end.